Moving into the final chapter of the book of Ephesians. And how many have heard your children say this to one another at some point about, you ain't the boss of me? And how often have we wanted to say that to our boss, maybe? Things like that. So we're heading into that portion of Ephesians. And so with that, I am going to start with the opening passage today. It's Ephesians chapter 6, and we're in verses 1 through 9. And it says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. And you, fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. And you, masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him." Okay, so jumping into the first two verses, we get to pick on the kids right out the gate today, right? "Children, obey your parents, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise." So we're talking to the children, and we're talking to obey. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on obey yet, because we're going to see that word again here a little bit. But obey means to do what you're told. Okay, that's the simple answer for obey. Okay, and you obey your parents. And you do it in the Lord. And this in the Lord is equivalent to, basically, this might be a little wordy or too big of words for kids, but it's by virtue of spiritual fellowship or union with Christ. In other words, because as you grow older and you have your own personal relationship with God, is that you have this, by the virtue of that salvation you have in Christ, the love you have for Christ, that is how you obey your parents, and it's right. It's just the proper thing to do, okay? Duty demands that you do this. And then verse 2, honor your father and mother. And so we need to honor them. And I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a skew, because most of our congregation are not children, okay? But we still have this idea of honoring our father and mother. And so what I want to take, and the reason why I'm going down this path is I find it interesting that Jesus uses this passage to correct the Pharisees, so to speak. Okay? And in Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 9, we see that the scribes and the Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." So in other words, the Pharisees, they came up with all these ways. You need to do this. You need to stand on one foot while you wash with the right hand and patted your head. You know, they had all these weird ways to take care of things. So the disciples were walking with Jesus, and they plucked some grain and were eating it, and they didn't wash their hands, okay? And it says, so Jesus answered. He answered and said to them, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say," so here's what the Pharisees are doing to get out of honoring their father and mother, "whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift from God." In other words, what these Pharisees were doing is that becoming part of the Pharisaic cult, almost, or the religion or the sect, they had to give their tithes and give money to support the Pharisaical sect, okay? And so what they were doing is that if they got money, they would give that to the Pharisaical sect that they got to partake of, instead of caring for their parents, okay? And so what Jesus says then is that then he, the one that does this, not honor his father or mother, thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Okay, so these things with the way they washed their dishes and took care of this and did that was part of the tradition, part of the thing. There's an oral, what they call the oral law, that they kind of piggybacked on the written law way back when, and they kept adding to it, making it harder to live, and that's why it was such a burden for the people to try to live under the same guidelines as the Pharisees. Okay, it says, hypocrites. Well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And that's the constant thing, especially in the New Testament. Jesus shows us in the Gospels, and it's continually reiterated, is that God cares about the heart. Okay? And so by them coming up with this nice rule that they could still follow the law, okay, it actually was not part of the law. It's just a tradition. It says, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Okay? So that little segue is that we as adults still need to care and honor our parents as adults. Okay, that means and I know many of you here have done that with your parents in the past, and that's the thing, is when our parents need us, we need to be there for them. That's the point. It's not just tell your under the 18-year-olds, you obey your parents because that's the commandment. It's no, obey your parents through life by honoring them, not obeying, but by honoring them through life. Okay, and then it says, which is the first commandment with promise. And this is pretty good because it is the first commandment with promise, and we'll get into that in the next verse where it says, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. So what we see here is we see a couple of quotes around verse 3, and that means Paul is quoting something. He's quoting the Ten Commandments. And part of the Ten Commandments says that you may live long on the earth. And here it is, Exodus 20:12. It's the fourth commandment, I think the fourth commandment, and it says, honor your father and your mother that your days may be long upon the land. And that's the promise. So if you look at the commandments, there's that promise within that commandment that when he's speaking to the children to honor their father and mother and to obey their parents, it's got a promise that you may, if you do that, this idea that you will live long on the earth. And of course, it doesn't necessarily say prosper, okay? So live long and prosper, it just live long, okay? All right, and then moving on to verse 4, because this is where we start getting a little bit more to nuts and bolts. It says, and you fathers do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. So, for some reason, Paul feels the need to address the fathers in this. It's kind of like, I think it's along the lines of dad jokes. You don't hear of mom jokes, you hear of dad jokes, right? And everybody kind of doesn't like dad jokes necessarily. So, I got one for you. Two dads walk into the congregation, and everybody groans. It fell flat. That was the joke. Okay, anyway, moving on to that failure. It says, do not provoke your children to wrath, okay? And so it seems pretty coarse and pretty hard, but I want the way I want to kind of explain this is that it's more like an exasperation to anger. So fathers, do not exasperate your children. And I have to say, when Josie and I first got together and she had the nerve to say that her and her mom did scrapbooking trips together, that I was left alone with Connor and Caleb for the first time. And they were 5 and 7. Okay? And I kind of exasperated one of them. So Caleb, the youngest, I'm giving them dinner. I'm putting dinner on the table, and they have their little cup, and they had just had milk, okay? And so they wanted something else to drink, so I had some Kool-Aid, okay? Well, I went and poured the Kool-Aid into Caleb's cup, and there was a little ring of milk around the bottom, and he threw a fit. He was just totally upset that there was milk in his. I'm like, there's no milk in your Kool-Aid. That was just, and to this day, I will have you know that Caleb insists that there was a half a cup of milk left in that cup that I made him drink, okay? So that's what this idea is do not exasperate your children where they just feel like they have no recourse, they have no hope, they're just getting yelled at, they're getting corrected, or what have you. we don't want to do that to them where they just feel like they just feel like, I can't win for losing, right? So fathers, do not exasperate your children, but then we are to bring them up in the training and the admonition of the Lord. And possibly better understanding of this set is to say nurturing instead of training, because we already know from admonition that it can be a warning or a reprimand. And so this training and reprimand, it's like we got to lay down the law, and we do, okay? But there's also this idea of nurturing, okay? And I like the way the Contenders Bible and Contenders of the Faith Bible commentary puts it, is it says this, and it says parents, but fathers take note because we're picking on you right now. It says, when parents explain the scriptural foundation for the boundaries and decisions that are made, they are bringing children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Nurture suggests the whole training and education of children. This term is very generic and encompasses all aspects of teaching and training children. Nurturing also involves setting boundaries and enforcing them, including punishment for the purpose of improved behavior. In other words, dads don't jump to the admonition and the punishment right away because you might exasperate them, but make sure they understand the reason for which they might be getting in trouble, the correction that is needed, and the basis of the need for that. Okay, and so again, fathers, don't exasperate your children, but bring them up in the nurturing admonition of the Lord. Then in verse 5, bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ. Now we get to pick on a lot of things, okay? And the first thing I want to pick on is bondservants and masters. And some people might be like, I ain't a bondservant, I ain't a master. I'm good. Okay, I don't have to worry about that passage. But I want to see that, and also bondservants, basically it's slave. Okay, everywhere in the Greek when you see bondservant, servant, or slave, it's the same Greek word. They just like to try to, because it is somewhat contextual, meaning that a bondservant might have more freedom than an actual slave, but they're still under the control of a master. Okay. And so, again, in a spiritual context, you're going to be a slave of something in this world. You're going to have a boss, or you're not going to have a boss, okay? And so, in a spiritual sense, Romans 6:16 says, do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are the ones slaves, whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or obedience leading to righteousness, okay? And so again, we are, as Christians, we obey Christ because we're leading to righteousness, and we're not going to be slaves of sin, obeying every whim and fancy of sin. Okay? And so again, bondservants and masters according to the flesh. So, that being said, this really could read in today's day and age, employees. Well, I'm an employee, I'm not a bondservant. Well, you get a paycheck, and if you don't do what your boss says, you don't get a paycheck, right? So yes, you have the freedom to quit that job, but while you're doing that job, you are a bondservant, you are a slave, so to speak. And so it says, employees, be obedient to those who are bosses according to the flesh. Okay? And then here's where obedient comes back in. And I know I really beat this one to death between the wives and the men, and I use this example of what submit is not, right? Subservient. Submit is not subservient, serving or acting as a subordinate, and that subordinate, again, wives are not subordinate to men because they are not a lower order or rank or of less importance or inferior. Well, guess what obey is? Obey is subordinate. Okay? This is why, I don't know if you remember back when we were talking about the wives, I did not want to use the word obey instead of submit, because obey has an additional connotation that submit does not. And that is, you are of lower order or rank, of less importance and inferior. Now, I think as parents to children that they're more lower in order or rank, not less important. Okay? But that truly is what it means to obey. So employees, be obedient to those who are your bosses according to the flesh. Okay? And how? With fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ. Let's talk about this fear and trembling a little bit, okay? Because, again, we're talking about your relationship with your boss, okay? And guess what this fear and trembling means when it's used together? And this is the same term that's used in Philippians 2:12, where it says, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And we're talking about God, between us and God. This phrasing, fear and trembling, is used to describe the anxiety of one who distrusts his ability completely to meet all requirements, but religiously does his utmost to fulfill his duty. That's the way we're supposed to apply ourselves in our jobs, right? Is that we won't measure up, that we can't measure up, but we're going to do our darndest to measure up, okay? And then sincerity of heart. This is the idea that it's without dissimulation. I like the word, but it's kind of hard without knowing it. But this meaning you don't have an ulterior motive. And I guess we have a right to have an ulterior motive because we're getting a paycheck, but we're not supposed to perform our duties as if, well, I don't get paid enough to do that. You know, that's not what that means. It means that we are going to be sincere as to Christ. We're following Christ, not our boss. Okay? And then, moving on to verse 5, and continue. Oh, that was verse 5. Sorry. Moving on to verse 6. It says, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Not with our bondservants of Christ. I want to cover first because here's that bondservant again. And no, you are not an employee of Christ, okay? We are still slaves of Christ. It's flat out. I think I did one study once that in the medieval times that bondservant came about to kind of lessen the idea of slavery because they had the serfs outside that they were basically slaves, but not really, so they called them bondservants. So anyway, we are slaves of Christ. That's to the point. We are slaves of Christ. As Christians, we should be following Christ, completely obedient to Him. Okay? Meaning not with eye service. Okay? So now I'm going to give you a little bit of story about eye service, a visual for eye service. How's that? Okay? This right here is an aerial view of Fort Lewis. I'm going to tell you that I was guilty of eye service, but it was because of my staff sergeant. But anyway, this is an aerial view of Fort Lewis. That thing in the middle is an airfield to give you a idea of scope. That green circle is where the barracks, the unit headquarters, and even over there in the woods was the motor pool. Okay? The red square up in the upper right, across the airfield, okay, was what we called a cantonment area, which we could go to and do some training. It was a little field that had, and it's this little group of trees, and we could take our Humvee out there. I was a fire direction for artillery. Basically, we computed the data for the artillery to fire, and so we would take our Humvee out there, and we could set up, and we could do some training, okay? This was my E6's idea. We went there to do training, but the training consisted of parking the Humvee, shutting the gate, and playing spades all day. Okay? All right? And so it was the perfect setup and the perfect location because it was gated. And so we had the equipment there, and if somebody of import came up and had to come through the gate, the rest of us were busily cleaning up the cars and being like, okay, what's the next mission that we're doing? You know, okay? That is a perfect example of eye service. Only doing your job when the boss is looking, okay? And then as men pleasers as well, okay? Men pleasers, basically, you're doing it for, and this is kind of makes sense but doesn't make sense. You're not doing it for your boss, but you're doing it for your boss type thing. Meaning, you're not doing it to please your boss, even though you're doing it to please your boss. You want a good paycheck. You want to be promoted. You know, you have a career plan. And so, yes, you're doing it to please you, but that's not your primary motivation, okay? Because as slaves to Christ, we're doing the will of God from the heart. So we're doing God's primary purpose for us from the heart. It's a heart thing. It's not a just doing the job because it's the job, going to the daily grind because it's the daily grind. We're doing the will of God. We're setting a witness by the way we work, the way we function in the workplace. that shows people the Christ we know, okay? And if you don't realize that, you need to realize that some of the Christ people see, the only Christ some people see is you, okay, in the workplace. So remember that, okay? And doing the will of God from the heart. It says, with good will during service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. Okay? With good will during doing service as to the Lord. Again, as to the Lord. Slaves of Christ. The will of God. You get this point that everything we do in our job is to please God and Christ and not to please man. Okay? And again, not to man. Okay? And this good will is basically, it's not merely being polite, okay? But it's an active and sincere desire for another's good that springs from the fact that we're Christians. That's the motivation for us to do this goodwill service. Okay? Knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord. Okay? So again, we're not doing it for the boss, and we're not doing it for the reward, but when we're doing it for the Lord, from the heart, we get good things from the Lord. Okay? And whether he is slave or free. Again, so whether he is an employee or free. And some of you might think, well, I'm still not an employee. Okay, I think free can mean whether you're unemployed or retired, or you're just a bum, and maybe you're independently wealthy. So it fits for all of you, okay? Whether you are an employee or free, okay? So with that, over those verses, I came up with what I call an employee's creed based on those verses. This is a writing of my own making, okay? And so an employee's creed based on those verses we just covered. I will obey the duties from my boss in a subordinate manner, shaking in my boots that I might get fired. I will perform my duties happily so that I do not need to conceal my thoughts. I will work whether or not my boss is looking, not to please him, but to please Christ, to whom I am a slave. I will do my job as if I am working directly for God and not my boss. I know any good I do or get from my job is to or from the Lord. It does not matter whether I am a slave or an employee. Okay? This is the manner and the method by which we should be doing our jobs. I know we're not perfect and it seems like a big ask, but you know, the Bible has a lot of big asks of us, doesn't it? Okay? And so, again, employees' creed. So now we get to kind of pick on the bosses a little bit. It says, and you bosses do the same things to employees, giving up, threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. Again, so bosses do the same things, the same mindset, the same motive, the same interaction. As a boss, we are supposed to show that to our employees as well, and giving up, threatening. In other words, man, if you don't do that, I'm going to fire you. If you don't do that, this. If you don't function off of threats. If you're a manager or a boss, have policies, have processes, have things in place so that they're well trained, they know what they can and can't do, and don't feel like any moment they're going to lose their job. That's how we should function as bosses. Okay? Because we know that our own master or boss also is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. So again, there's no partiality. In other words, whether you're the boss and get to call the shots, or you're the employee and you're the one that the shots are being called on, right? It does not matter, because our boss is in heaven, and he doesn't have a partiality between a boss or an employee, right? And so that with a closing verse on that idea in a spiritual context as well, Romans 2:11, for there is no partiality with God. God does not offer one salvation to one group of people over another. He doesn't offer salvation to one person over another. He offers salvation to everybody, okay? He has no partiality. He does not, he is not unjust or unfair in anything he deems or doles out, okay? And that leads me to my so what. It says, whether we are a child or parent, an employee or employer, as a Christian, we have an obligation to operate as Christ would in that position. So if you're a kid, you got to obey your parents. If you're a parent, you got to raise up your child the way he should go. If you're an employee, you got to listen to your boss. If you're an employer, you got to treat your employees right. So we, as a Christian, again, if I slow down and say it right enough, some people, the only Christ they see is what comes out of you on the job. Okay? And that's a heavy burden and a heavy responsibility that we need to always be mindful of and be aware of when we're in the workforce. Okay? And then my point to ponder says, whatever position you are in, child, parent, employee, boss, what is a behavior regarding that you need to change that is not Christ-like? How are you behaving on the job that is like, ooh, that's not Christ-like? What can you change? Okay? And then finalize memorizing Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. And then read Colossians chapter 4, the final chapter of Colossians. Okay?